What is up, guys? Welcome back to my channel. Today we're talking about the coronavirus, God's judgment, and the end time.
As I'm recording this video, there's over 14,300 confirmed cases of the coronavirus spread all over the world. Can it really be that the Bible predicted this? We will see in this video that it did.
Of the 21st century, these massive natural disasters are intensifying. Now, what's this mean? Well, if you're asking me, I firmly believe that the world is getting ready for the tribulation.
But there is no doubt that these are the last days. Say, when Jesus was speaking about the signs of the time, he spoke of earthquakes. Rings a bell, huh? These last days, they are intensifying. Earthquakes are now a norm to earth dwellers.
You know, the Bible warns us, of course, of the increasing number of earthquakes, right? As the return of the Lord draws near, as the day of the Lord draws near, right? That you're going to see increasing number of earthquakes.
Jesus made it clear at Luke 21:11 that pestilence would be part of the sign of the last days. And in Revelation chapter 6, the ride of the fourth horseman includes mention of deadly plague. So the events unfolding around us are making clearer than ever that we're living in the final part of the last days, undoubtedly the final part of the final part of the last days, shortly before the last day of the last days.
Told the brothers in the coordinators committee office, you know, when we're facing these disasters and all these things, and I've been telling them for some time now, cheer up, it's going to get worse. And so we keep a sense of humor with it, but that's a fact. What we're experiencing right now in this global pandemic, I was telling the branch class yesterday, it doesn't bother me. We've been waiting for this.
So, we have the big question: is it the end of the world? Every few years, it seems like some kind of natural disaster or something like that happens, and Jehovah's Witnesses and other doomsday groups start claiming that those natural disasters or a particular natural disaster or world event is proof that the end is right around the corner, or that that these are the end times or something of that nature. And so I just wanted to take a little bit of time to go over those claims, especially in regard to the beliefs of Jehovah's Witnesses, and kind of break them down a little bit and see exactly what Jehovah's Witnesses claim is happening and should happen during the end times, and then see if that matches up with what is actually happening in the world. Now, of course, the reason that I'm making this video is because at the moment there is a pretty serious virus going around. Most countries have taken pretty drastic precautions in order to prevent the spread. I guess I can say it out loud. Hopefully I don't get flagged or this video taken down, but the virus is called the coronavirus. It has about a 2% kill rate, as far as they know, mostly affecting older people and people with pre-existing conditions such as heart or lung issues. But it's very dangerous, and Jehovah's Witnesses seem to be latching on to that as proof that we're in the end times, or that that the end is right around the corner. I believe Stephen Lett said that that they were entering the last days of the last days. And so, like I said before, I wanted to kind of examine what Jehovah's Witnesses claim we should be seeing in the world, what they claim is happening in the world, and then look at the actual numbers to see whether or not what they're claiming is true. The first thing that I want to examine is earthquakes. This is a big one for a lot of Jehovah's Witnesses. The organization for a very long time claimed that since 1914, the number of earthquakes around the world had drastically increased, more than any other period in human history. Now, I'm going to go over some figures in a second here, and perhaps I'll insert it randomly into the video, but that is just blatantly false. In reality, the earthquakes have not increased since 1914. In fact, the number of earthquakes has remained virtually unchanged for the last several thousand years, based on the information that we have and based on scientific readings that have been done. There's absolutely no evidence to suggest that earthquakes have been increasing. The organization eventually admitted that and changed their position, instead saying that perhaps the number of earthquakes hadn't increased, but the damage done by those earthquakes and the death toll had, which was also false. Because even though we definitely have more people on the earth right now, and a lot of times coastal cities are more populated than cities on the interior of whatever continent you're on. Even though those coastal cities, which often get the brunt of earthquakes, or many of them get the brunt of earthquakes because there's added risk because of flooding and tsunamis and things like that. In spite of having more people living on those coastal areas or in those coastal areas, because of human ingenuity, the death toll has actually gone down. So even though there are oftentimes more people in an area where there's an earthquake, the people who are actually harmed by it, the damage that's done, has been drastically decreased. So that's an interesting thing to think about. And it leads into a point that I'm going to make in a little while. Now, before we get into the statistics as far as how many earthquakes there's been over the last couple thousand years, I wanted to go over a little bit of information as far as what causes earthquakes. And the best way to do that, I thought, was to show a Discovery Channel video that just gives a brief overview of what causes them.
Every day, the Earth is shaken by hundreds of small earthquakes. Most go unnoticed. They usually occur along the boundaries of the thin plates that cover the Earth like an eggshell. Driven by the heat deep within the Earth's core, the plates grind against each other on long lines called faults.
Most earthquake-inducing stress is caused by the movement of tectonic plates. Tectonic plates are constantly moving, either against, away, along, or underneath each other. But sometimes their edges may catch and stick. The plates, however, continue to move, or at least attempt to. Energy from this attempted movement builds around the edge's sticking point, creating immense pressure until the edges are forced to let go and the plates slip. This causes a sudden and powerful release of energy, so powerful that it breaks the Earth's crust. This fracturing emits shock waves through the ground and causes intense vibrations, or quakes.
So the reason I wanted to go over what causes earthquakes is because I think it's important to understand what's happening with our planet and why earthquakes occur. Now, obviously, there's nothing supernatural going on. It's simply the shifting of tectonic plates due to, like the video said, the fact that we have a molten core and the fact that those plates are constantly moving and grinding against one another. The problem is, though, that the Bible writers and most other people of that era didn't actually understand what caused earthquakes. And so, of course, they prescribed some kind of supernatural element to them, believing that they were a sign of anger from God and that somehow they were representative of God's judgment. However, an accurate understanding of what causes earthquakes enables you to kind of understand why earthquakes, or at least the number of earthquakes over the last several thousand years, has basically remained the same. And that is, of course, because the structure of the earth has remained the same since basically the Cambrian. So that, like I said, is just something important to note going forward in understanding why the statistics are the way that they are and why we can say for certain that there has not been an increase in earthquakes. Getting into the data from the U.S. Geological Survey, we're able to see that the number of major earthquakes that have happened throughout the last 100 years or so, since 1900, has not increased whatsoever. In fact, the number of earthquakes that are magnitude 7.5 and higher has remained fairly constant. And most scientists agree that it has been that way for the last several thousand years. Now, one thing important to note about this data is that there has been a slight increase in the number of earthquakes that have been recorded, especially smaller ones. But that doesn't have to do with the fact that earthquakes themselves have increased. It has to do with the fact that the technology that we use in order to record earthquakes and any sort of seismic activity has greatly improved over the last couple hundred years. So although there has been an increase in the number of seismic sensors and thus an increase in the number of small earthquakes that have been able to be recorded, that doesn't reflect the fact that there's been an increase in earthquakes overall. And as I said, any major earthquakes, 7.5 and over, have remained constant for the last several thousand years. Now, this didn't stop the organization from making ridiculously outlandish claims, even going as far as to claim that the number of major earthquakes had increased 20 times since 1914. Now, this was ridiculous, and the organization eventually was inundated with questions and information from people saying that what they were saying just was not true, and that the earthquakes, or the number of major earthquakes, had not increased over the last 100 years, and in fact had not increased over the last several thousand years. In response to that, in spite of decades of claiming that earthquakes had increased, the organization changed their doctrine and instead started claiming that although the major earthquakes had not increased, that didn't really matter because Jesus' prophecy didn't specify that the number of earthquakes would increase. So mind you, they were saying that for many years, and it would have been considered apostasy to challenge that belief at the time. However, then the organization completely changed their tune, claiming that they had not increased, but that didn't matter. So basically, according to the Watchtower's new interpretation of events, the apostles went to Jesus and asked him what the signs of the last days would be, and his response to them was essentially,
Nothing, absolutely nothing, absolutely nothing.
Now, this was obviously just an excuse to try and explain away the fact that what they had been saying for years wasn't true, and what they were expecting to see on the world scene also wasn't taking place. They did, however, add an extra element to the discussion, which I want to address just in case someone feels like I'm misrepresenting their statements. They basically changed the doctrine from the number of earthquakes has increased to the number of people affected by earthquakes has increased. So I wanted to look into that a little bit and see if the facts actually match up with that claim. Now, again, the organization distorts the facts and exaggerates the number of people who've actually died from earthquakes, going as far as to claim that 10 times the number of people died from earthquakes after 1914 every year than before 1914. However, when we look at the data, we see that the opposite is actually true. And the most destructive earthquakes that have ever happened, the 10 of them are listed here, only 2 of them took place after 1914, and they don't even come close to ranging at the top of the death toll. So the claim that more people died after 1914 is just untrue. But the next thing that I wanted to talk about was wars. And of course, Jehovah's Witnesses point to the scriptures that talk about there being wars in one place after another, and then point to skirmishes and wars that happen in the world today, trying to make the point that there are more wars and more people dying from war than at any time in human history, which, again, is false. In fact, the percentage of people who are engaged in war and dying from warfare in the world now is far less than it has ever been all throughout human history, and especially since World War II. The number of wars has drastically decreased. Now you can see with the chart here starting in 1400 that the number of people affected by wars has basically remained the same since around 1600. And we can see that that pattern continues all the way up until the 1950s, around World War II. And then we see a drastic decline in the number of wars that the world has seen, and especially the number of people affected by wars. Now, this is a chart that hones in on that period that I was speaking of from around 1940 all the way up until now. And you can see that there has been a steady decline in the number of people affected by war. There's been a steady decline overall in the number of wars as well. Now, this certainly doesn't mean that wars have been completely eliminated. In fact, it's quite likely that there will always be wars on this planet. However, it definitely goes against the claims that the organization makes about wars increasing, or the number of wars increasing. This, of course, leads right into the next topic, which is famine, which is something else that the Bible writers claimed would be prevalent during the time of the end. However, again, we see a sharp decline in the number of people experiencing famine and the number of famines throughout the world. The last thing, of course, is pestilence, or diseases that are spreading throughout the world. Now, the organization right now, again, is trying to claim that this pandemic is proof that we're living in the end times. However, just the briefest Google search will tell you that the number of deaths due to pestilence throughout human history, if we actually look at the figures of the number of people who have been affected by pestilence and diseases over the last several thousand years, we'll see that, again, human ingenuity has come to the rescue in order to drastically reduce the number of people who are affected by diseases and pestilence. In fact, the steps that many countries are taking right now in order to prevent the spread of this disease is another example of how we as humans have progressed to the point where a lot of these things that in the past would have either wiped out entire populations or run roughshod with the elderly and infirm. These things are now able to be handled in a semi-reasonable way. And the number of deaths due to those things, again, have been reduced. Now, I'm going to start sounding like a broken record here, but if we just look at the statistics once again, we'll see that there definitely have been plagues since 1914, but to try to claim that the number of deaths is far greater, or that the number of plagues is greater, or that the impact it has on people is greater, is just demonstrably false. The effect that plagues have on people today versus the way that they affected people in the past, there's just no comparison. You just simply cannot say that pestilences have gotten worse since 1914. That's just something that is factually inaccurate. Of course, that doesn't stop the organization from making those claims, because they need those claims to be true for their religion to be true. Now, I kind of wanted to also discuss a hypothetical situation, because although I've gone over all of the figures and you can see that most all of those things have not increased over the last 100 years or so, the question might be asked, what if they had? Let's say since 1914, or over the last 200 years even, let's just say that we started seeing an increase in the number of deaths due to pestilence or diseases. So the question might be asked, wouldn't that prove that we were living in the last days if those things had increased? And for that, I kind of wanted to point to the mid-14th century during the Black Plague, because there were certainly a lot of people at that time who were pointing to the situation and correctly stating that, look, the amount of death that we're seeing due to plagues the world has never seen something this bad before. And they were right. The world had not seen death due to plagues to that extent. And yet, even though there had been a noticeable and factual increase in the number of those deaths, it still didn't mean that it was the end of the world. Now, I can hear people now saying, wait. So you're saying that the fact that these things haven't increased is proof that it's not true, but even if they had, it also wouldn't be proof that it's true. And my answer is yes, that is correct. And the reason being is, like I said, even in times in the past where it was true and where there had been an increase in these things, that wasn't proof that the Bible was true. That wasn't proof that the Bible is inspired by God or any of those prophecies were correct. All it demonstrates is the fact that, as always, there are statistical ups and downs when it comes to all of those things. Like I said before, there's always going to be diseases. There's always going to be wars, quite likely. Earthquakes have been around since the beginning of time. Those are just things that are going to happen and going to continue to happen. And sometimes there are more and sometimes there are less. But determining whether or not the Bible is an inspired book of prophecy, determining whether or not Jehovah's Witnesses are correct, let's just pretend like we have proof that the Bible is factually correct, that wouldn't prove that Jehovah's Witnesses are the true religion or that they have the correct interpretation. So, as I said before, even like in the past, if those things did increase and if we saw a massive spike in war or diseases or food shortages, even if we did see
a spike in those things over the next 100 years or so. That wouldn't be proof that Jehovah's Witnesses were correct about the 1914 doctrine. That wouldn't be proof that their beliefs as far as their leaders being chosen by God in 1919 is correct. It wouldn't be proof that they're living the last days. As I said before, there's going to be ups and downs when it comes to all of those things. And so proving whether or not Jehovah's Witnesses have the right religion and proving whether or not what they believe is true needs to be examined separately from the questions as to whether or not there have been an increase in any of those things. Now, as we have examined, there has not been, and the organization has repeatedly lied about that fact and tried to twist the statistics and try and twist the facts in order to fit what they believe should be happening. But like I said, determining whether or not Jehovah's Witnesses are the true religion is a separate question and should be the most important question for Jehovah's Witnesses. If you're looking at this situation and you're looking at the world events, your thoughts should not be, does this particular plague prove that my religion is true? Your religion needs to be proven true based on completely separate criteria. It needs to be proven true based on its doctrines, specifically the 1914 doctrine, and whether or not you can prove that Jerusalem was actually destroyed in 607 and that Jesus actually came invisibly in 1914 and chose the governing body and Jehovah's Witnesses as his sole religion in 1919. That it needs to be your focus.
It's interesting because it's clear that the Bible writers, when choosing which or what kind of events would predict the end of the world, purposely chose things that were commonplace, that humans have dealt with since the beginning of time and will likely always deal with. And they seem to have chosen those things because it's very easy to say that there's going to be wars, there's going to be diseases, there's going to be food shortages, there's going to be earthquakes. The one thing that the Bible writers could not have predicted was the fact that human ingenuity and industrialization would push mankind forward to the point where most of those things have been not entirely eliminated, but reduced to the point where they're not a serious threat or have not been a serious threat for a very long time. And when they do pop up, they're able to get a grasp of the situation and able to start effectively dealing with it almost right away. Whether that be quarantining or developing early treatments, something like that. And we're seeing that with even this current situation. I always found it funny that the Bible writers chose those specific things because in their mind, that was the easiest way to have a prophecy fulfilled, because in reality, they might as well have said the sun will rise in the morning and you'll see the moon at night. Those prophecies were guaranteed to happen because they chose things that have always happened, and they knew that they would continue to happen, which is why virtually every generation of Christians since the Bible was written and since Christianity became a prominent force in the world, virtually every generation has been convinced that they were living in the last days and that world events proved conclusively that they were in the end times. So choosing things that they knew would continue made it very easy to keep people hooked on the religion and keep them waiting for the end. With Jehovah's Witnesses, I'm not claiming that they are unique in their belief of the end times, and I've dealt with several different evangelicals and Christian groups, even other religious groups that are convinced that what's happening in the world confirms their personal beliefs as far as the end times. And so Jehovah's Witnesses certainly don't have a monopoly on latching on to every little world event, or I shouldn't say little, every world event and every war, every disease, everything that they can possibly construe in order to prop up their beliefs. So getting back to the original question, are we living in the last days, or is there any evidence that would suggest that what Jehovah's Witnesses are claiming as far as what's happening in the world and the signs that we should be seeing right now to prove that these are the end times? No. Nothing that they claim should be happening is happening. And as far as the Bible writers are concerned, nothing that they predicted that was supposedly supposed to happen is happening, which is interesting. It's good that we can see that the Bible writers could not have predicted the vast increases in medical advancements, the increases in technology to prepare for earthquakes, the bioengineering and mass production of crops that has helped prevent food shortages. There's no way they could have predicted any of those things. And yet we can see now that a lot of what they thought would happen, or a lot of what they were hoping would happen, just simply hasn't materialized. But again, groups like Jehovah's Witnesses need to focus on any kind of disaster that shows up. They need to latch on to every single little disease, every war, every skirmish, every time there's any place in the world that doesn't have food. They latch on to those things, ignoring the statistics and ignoring the vast numbers of people who aren't affected by those things. They latch on to them in order to try and confirm their beliefs and their view of the world. And unfortunately for them, the facts just aren't on their side as far as what they believe should be happening and what is actually happening. So I hope you guys found this video interesting, and I'll catch you next time.